Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host Nathan, and I'm joined fireside by my co-host Darren, ExoAcademian. Darren, I want to quickly kind of set the scene for folks. We are outside again. No, sorry to disappoint our listeners, we're not at a soccer field this time. We are sitting by a nice fire, actually out at my house. And the sky is fairly cloudy, but the clouds are moving at a good clip, and we can see the moon really brightly through the clouds, and it's just painting a beautiful picture. If you can hear any background noise, you're likely to hear the crackle of the fire, the rustle of the leaves, as well as the wind in the air. But Exo, we've not done this in a long time. I'm a little fearful what our listeners will say. How are you feeling about our second episode live outside?
So far, so good. You know, I think that initial attempt, we didn't know how many atmospheric noises there would be. But this time we kind of took a precaution, and, you know, like Nathan said, we're in his front yard, actually, where he's got this beautiful fire pit with these chairs around it, kind of a rock formation backdrop, and we can see the Blue Ridge Mountains off in the distance through the trees. Beautiful scene, and it's very quiet other than the subtle crackle of the fire, so I think we're going to be good. Yeah,
it's really quite nice. Well, tonight we're going to explore the intersection of physics and metaphysics. And we're going to explore that. We're going to jump off into that topic through something that I think a lot of our listeners are familiar with. It's certainly talked about quite frequently in UFO circles, and that is the infamous slide 9. And so I've got slide 9 up in front of me. I'm going to read through that, and then we're going to just go into some of the different things that come to mind related to this important slide. So the title of the slide is DoD Threat Scenario, and there's a parenthetical there in the title, ATIP Sub-Focus Areas. And the content reads, the science exists for an enemy of the United States to manipulate both physical and cognitive environments in order to penetrate U.S. facilities, influence decision makers, and compromise national security. And then it lists the following bullets: psychotronic weapons, cognitive human interface, or CHI, penetration of solid surfaces, instantaneous sensor disassembly, alteration/manipulation of biological organisms, anomalies in the space-time construct, unique cognitive human interface experiences. And then it states DoD advantages. DoD has been involved in similar experiments in the past. DoD has relationships with renowned subject matter experts. DoD controls several facilities where activities have been detected. And in the bottom of this slide, probably one of the more powerful statements, what was considered quote-unquote phenomena is now quantum physics. All right, well, there's a lot in that slide, and more and more I'm finding that folks raise the slide as kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card to talk about, really insert your phenomena of choice and say, hey, we're studying this. Clearly, we have some insights into this. Look at slide 9. And usually where they will land is exactly where the slide lands, and that is in the realm of quantum physics. That quantum physics, our understanding of quantum mechanics, is pointing in the direction of many of these observed phenomena. And the subtext really being that our science is now getting to a place where these phenomena are entering into the realm of understandable science and technology. And I think that's a very powerful statement. I also find it to be quite seductive because it implies that we are on the cusp, if we haven't already arrived, at being able to do many of the things the slide states. and that we're able to do so through our knowledge of and manipulation of quantum science and quantum reality. But Exo, I want to explore this a little bit more. What are some things that you think about when you see this brought up in conversation and folks pointing to this as, oh wow, look, here it is, here's the answer?
Yeah, we probably will go back and forth on this a few times. I think that'll be helpful for people because there's a lot to break down. One of the things I studied is something called neuro-linguistic programming. And basically, it comes down to the way you say things, the way you communicate is meant to program people's brain. It's meant to produce certain kind of responses in people's brains. And when I read slide 9, it's very clear to me that it's written for a very specific audience, and it's meant to communicate some unusual, unorthodox, unconventional ideas to that audience, right? And to do it in such a way that they feel less freaked out about it and see it as a sort of a recipe for advantageous military infrastructure even moving forward versus other Earth adversaries, right? Other nation states. So what I really hear in a lot of that is when they say at the end, it's kind of strange at the end, they don't even say anomalous phenomena, they just say phenomena, which is actually not very well stated, right? That's kind of vague.
Right.
But what they're really saying is anomalous phenomena is now just quantum physics. You could also say magic is really just quantum physics. So they're taking it out of woo land and saying, listen, this lands squarely within our model of physicalism, albeit with the quantum realities and quantum theory. If you go there, then suddenly all of this makes sense. And not only that, but it's potentially actionable information that could, again, aid our military infrastructure moving forward.
I love that perspective, and I think that's important to remind folks that it comes out of a context. That's something that we really try hard to emphasize in our conversation when we take a look at any topic, that always understand the context in which the conversation is being had, or the understanding or conclusion it has been reached. And if you can understand that context, then you really know what folks are trying to get at there. I think the way you put it, this kind of bridging the divide between magical or what would, I'm sure, seem like insane abilities that were listed in some of those bullet points, and to bring that into an approachable space for an audience that may not be familiar with it or even take it seriously, and to say, hey, this is actually a lot of what our quantum physics and understanding, it's now pointing to the fact that these capabilities, which seem like magic and so strange, are actually capable and possible. And it's really quite profound. On the other hand, I think that in looking at this, I'm reminded of periods in history where a lot of unexplainable phenomena were observed and discussed within the intelligentsia of the day, and the conclusions they came to about that phenomena to get it from unexplainable to explainable were brought about by just the latest scientific advancements and understandings of reality. And because I'm aware of this, it reminds me that while this might be useful in that context we just talked about, it certainly can't be the end of the story. That really there is more to it than just, oh gee whiz, we've now learned that quantum physics allows us to do magic. That there's going to be sort of future areas of understanding that aren't related in any way at all to our quantum understanding of the world, that will eventually be part and parcel of the world we inhabit, and won't be strange, and we'll go, well, that must be what it is now. It's actually this. It's no longer quantum stuff. It's actually something else. So we're always kind of dealing with these sort of transitional periods and translating the day's best knowledge and understanding of reality, trying to make sense of the unknown.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see that looking back at history. And I'm reminded of that famous quote by Arthur C. Clarke that said something to the effect of, any sufficiently advanced technology will appear like magic to a less advanced civilization. And so, again, what this slide is trying to do is say, let's use language and words that people are familiar with. But it's how we put them together and what that is implying that is really interesting, right? So they're not going to use words like telepathy, right? Mm-hmm. Even though that might be what it's pointing towards. They'll use words that, again, a military audience, that this was initially, or an intelligence audience anyway, intelligence community audience that I think this was originally for, can understand, right? And again, it's all about intelligence and what's actionable. So again, that's the audience they're speaking to. That's why they're going to use that language. When you and I studied religious studies and biblical studies, we learned that different genres are such because they're actually trying to speak to different audiences. Mm-hmm. So even within the Gospels, you have some that are pitched differently than others because one might be geared towards a Jewish audience, another one more towards a Hellenistic audience, and that are not going to be so familiar with Jewish traditions. And so you're going to pitch it differently. You're going to use different words to say the same thing effectively, right? Mm-hmm. And in this case, again, we have these words are being used very carefully to be able to convey some very strange ideas to an audience. But to your point, yeah, I think a couple of things come to mind about this. Number one, when you think about times where a notion seemed outlandish, right? Like splitting the atom, right? The idea that you could, to even think about it, right? To even fathom this notion that you can think back to when we would say, what kind of weapon could we create if we could actually split the atom, right? Mm-hmm. It's a crazy notion. But what I think about with that is we go from something maybe that was originally intended, something could be used for energy, something for good purposes. Mm-hmm. And instead what it ends up being is turns into a weapon that, kills hundreds of thousands of people, right, and may one day be the demise of our entire civilization. So what I think about also when I listen or read slide 9 is what are the implications if we do manage to master some of these next level technologies? What ways will the military-industrial complex perhaps use those to be even more threatening to our civilization? Mm-hmm. What kind of mind control techniques might be developed from this kind of thing when it gets pursued, right? Right. You and I talked before we went on the air tonight that I think there's plenty of evidence that psychic influence happens from various others, various groups of others, some positive, sometimes not so positive, that can influence people's behavior, and in such a way that people don't even know necessarily that an outside influence is impacting their thought process. So what happens when the military finds out how to do that, right? You go into a war zone, and instead of attacking the opposite troops, you just control them with mind control, right? Things like that, which on the one hand, that could maybe create fewer casualties, but on the other hand, the history of the military-industrial complex in terms of using things for, only the best of intentions doesn't work out so well. So that's another thing I think about, and I'll turn it over for you for some thoughts on that. But after that, we can also jump into, like you kind of hinted at, what maybe beyond quantum physics does this point towards? And does quantum really capture the fullness of what's being implied with some of those technologies and some of those seemingly magical kind of notions? Right.
Well, one thing that came to mind as you were highlighting that point, the sirens were literally going off as you were talking about the dangers of militarizing this technology. And I'm laughing because those who are listening, we've been outside by this fire for over an hour and a half without any sirens or any sort of greater background music other than the sound of some insects. And then all of a sudden it started going crazy for quite a long time. But I'm also reminded, I just finished reading an excellent book that was recommended by Leah on UFO Twitter called When We Cease to Understand. And much of that book talks about some of the early kind of founding minds of quantum theory, and how many of them were essentially driven to madness or had intense bouts of madness or mania as they were grappling with and discovering some of the fundamental mathematics related to the understanding of quantum reality. And many of their conclusions after going through these intense periods of discovery were that we shouldn't, no one should know this, that it's too dangerous. It's, in the wrong context, it could be really deadly. And so some of them, I think even actively tried to destroy their own work because of the implications that they, I think, felt in the unlocking, the ability of that understanding to unlock realms of reality and capabilities that we probably don't have the maturity to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, when you bring that up, I think about the analogy of Lord of the Rings, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, it's very tempting and seductive to say, well, if the good guys have the ring, then maybe we can keep the peace, right?
Right.
But the understanding from the wise ones was that, Gandalf will be quick to point out to whatever hobbit he's speaking to that the only way to deal with that kind of thing is to destroy it, to not let it be wielded by, mortal beings, because they will be corrupted by it. And I think about that same thing. Again, we talked already about atomic technology, right? Atomic weapons. And the threat we all, sleep under every night, knowing that there's this potential to destroy our civilization several times over. It's a collective insanity when you really think about it, right? That we live under this kind of constant threat, even though it's usually dark and cold, right? But yeah, with the quantum aspect, that's true too. I mean, I think on a couple different ways, I think about that. Number one, yes, if you could weaponize that kind of understanding, that kind of level of reality, that could be game over, right? That could put to shame nuclear technology. It could be even more devastating, right? There's people even talked about, what if you accidentally open up a black hole, and everything collapses into a singularity, in a split second, something like that.
Right.
But what's also interesting is that some of those guys also became mystics, some of those early quantum researchers.
That's right.
Because they recognized that there was a kind of like magic behind reality itself, that it wasn't nearly as solid as it seemed, right? That even something like local realism is not really a thing, right? It just looks that way, which is a good jumping off point for us to move into the next part of the discussion. But you can go either way. You could either be driven to madness because everything you thought about the world and reality, suddenly that rug is pulled out from under you. On the other hand, you could from there develop much more of a spiritual or meaningful, energetic kind of understanding of reality, where somehow this underlying meaning structure and energy becomes what looks like physicality, right? And that opens up for new freedoms in terms of how to think about the physical world. But again, depending on who approaches that topic, they might have very different responses.
Well, it all gets really at something you've already touched on, and that's the maturity of our species to kind of grapple with these deeper layers of reality. And when our knee-jerk reaction is, how can we weaponize it? That to me kind of tells you all you need to know about where we are in the spectrum of sort of conscious development there. How big of a role does that play in your mind in understanding what's really going on with the phenomena? We've spent a lot of time tonight before the show, talking through the implications of phenomenal experience and the deeper kind of cosmology. And much of that conversation did come back to, really where are we in our development, and where are we supposed to go? What is the journey like? What are the lessons to be learned? And I find after that conversation, reflecting on so much of what we fixate on in our UFO conversation circles seems to be misplaced, because it really is often on the technology and how can we understand it and advance our understanding in science. And that in many ways is kind of missing the underlying point, and that's that we are here for a greater reason beyond just mastering our environment and overcoming physical matter, gaining a kind of godhood over our world through any means necessary, and skipping over important phases of our maturation to do so. Damn the consequences. What are you thinking about there in terms of the macro conversation we're having right now? I mean, we're on the cusp of this new UAP report, and all eyes are really on that and fixated on more nuts and bolts nuggets and hopes for this greater disclosure of this underlying reality that we're not alone. But stepping back from that, how do you assess where we are in light of what we just talked about?
Yeah, that's probably the most important question, and yet it's a question that's hardly ever talked about on UFO Twitter, for instance, or other media that we tend to spend time on. I mean, even as we talk about the history with the development of atomic weapons and then things like bioweapons, right? And the concern that some people have that, the coronavirus was something that was developed in a lab, right? Because it was technology that was being worked on to be a potential weapon in the future, right? Or something like that. Or even if someone was defensively trying to create an antidote to something negative and it just went awry, whatever the case, this is still our collective mentality, right? Is that we still look across the pond, or across a field and see somebody else behind a border, a different nation state, and we have an us versus them kind of mentality, a very tribal mentality. And my sense is, in terms of the positive elements of the UFO phenomenon, that is our biggest Achilles heel, our most central Achilles heel, is that we still don't think like a planetary civilization. We still don't make decisions based on the benefit of the all. We do it based on nation states and the latest edition of what a tribal kind of understanding means to us. So historically even, it's been the case, and we've kind of talked about this before, that when different non-human intelligence groups have interacted, for instance, with leaders, I say in quotes, of different nations, the temptation has been, how can we make an agreement, an accord with this non-human intelligence that could make it such that we won't lose some sort of, arena battle for the next century, right? Or next 500 years. You sometimes have these strange occurrences in history where various military people have said things like that, off the record, said things like, the United States will not lose a military campaign battle in the next, century or 500 years, right? Which is certainly hinting at, because we have technology that's so next generation that no other country could hope to match it on their own human development scale for centuries yet, right? So they're hinting at what kind of they've stumbled across. But undoubtedly, while we're still stuck in that kind of mentality, it's going to hold back our progression. It's going to definitely hold back the disclosure process because, kind of willy-nilly, the military-industrial complex will say, they'll claim national security everywhere you look, right? And so even now, there's battles going on within government. How much can we get away with not saying with this report, right? How can we, again, use neuro-linguistic programming to release a report that says as little as possible while still technically fulfilling the mandate from Congress, right? That's kind of where we're at, because the military-industrial complex wants to keep this for themselves so that they can, again, create advantageous situations over adversaries. And again, I would just point out that in the frame of reference for non-human intelligence that's positive, that's an incredibly barbaric kind of mentality. And yet we have to be honest with ourselves. That's where we basically are.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask, what does it look like for us to have a different perspective on the phenomena that we observe, one that's not rooted in how can I manipulate this and master this to my own advantage? Is to shift our perspective and look at it, from different angles, what are the conclusions that we might come to about reality itself, just by thinking through some of the implications of the observed phenomena, and some of which that I just listed at the beginning of the show.
Well, we've talked a few times now about a notion like idealism, this notion that reality is ultimately a process of mentation, or a derivative of a process of mentation, which basically means everything we see around us are basically thought forms, that all of the physicality is part of the illusion that has consistency within itself, but ultimately we kind of live in a kind of dreamscape. And we've also talked about how, I think several shows ago, maybe a few months ago now, before the summer, we talked about this notion that initially you had this kind of one cosmic intelligence, and from that you have these disassociated alters, is what Bernardo Kastrup calls them. Basically, that one cosmic intelligence splits off into different versions of itself. And by doing that, these individual selves that are kind of relative can have novel experience, which then can be contributed back to the cosmic intelligence, so the entire system learns and grows and develops and evolves, so that even the notion of, you could say, God evolves over time through these iterations of novel experience. But an implication of that is that the boundaries between each of us and everybody else, and all of the beings in the cosmos, all the sentient life, is that those boundaries are porous. That this is why telepathy and precognition and things like that and psychokinesis are possible, because ultimately it is all about thought forms. It is all about a mentation process. That when you think about that slide 9, a lot of that is what that's getting at, is that when you can operate on a level of reality where thought actually changes the manifestation of what looks like physical reality, and what seems to penetrate, it even said one of the points was penetrate solid surfaces, but even penetrating skulls, right? In the terms of being able to read minds, control minds, send thoughts, things like that. All of this is pointing towards the notions we've talked about with idealism, and fits really well with Bernardo's notion of analytic idealism and this model he's developed, where we are all disassociations of this one cosmic intelligence, and that's what allows for the porous nature between all of us, that ultimately our sense of selfhood is relative and not absolute, and there are porous boundaries between all of us, and some of these others understand that much more than we do, again, which opens up things like the possibility of psychic manipulation from positive and negative, which is part of what I believe is going on. But that's the kind of reality that the implications of slide 9 point towards.
Well, the irony here is that we like to think of ourselves as the masters of matter and of the material, but really we're actually we're enslaved to it. We cannot see beyond that which we sense, and it strikes me that so much of the phenomena, what it does so well is it creates cracks in that veneer and exposes the deeper connections that are really there. And when you begin to really wrestle with those implications, just as you say, this deeper connection that we really have with one another and to these non-human entities, all of the beings in the cosmos, from the sort of greatest conglomeration of a being down to the smallest instantiation, when you begin to wrestle with that, you come away with some very profound, I think, conclusions, and that the things which I do to another being, I'm really doing to myself. And how does that change the way in which we live, act in the world? I think it changes it in dramatic ways, and maybe part of one of the challenges that we wrestle with here with disclosure itself is we're not ready to have that conversation. We're not ready to face that's the implication. We would much rather continue on in our ways and continue to even more rigidly and in bold-faced marker define these boundaries between ourselves and our nations, and kind of plug our ears and our eyes and say, no, we're not connected. I am an individual. We are a nation state. We're not going to have any interaction at all. We're going to defend our people against your people at any cost, even if it means the destruction of our entire habitat, which is a very real threat that we seem to be facing today. But in the grander cosmology, we've talked about this a good bit tonight as well before the show. What kind of damage are we doing by perpetuating that kind of thinking?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I also want to be cautious to not make people think that I think the answer is plain and obvious and just sitting in front of us and we just need to act on it, because this is where we really get into nuance, which we tend to like on the show. By the way, I think when we chose the title Liminal Frames, we had no idea how relevant and how apt that would end up being. You know, I mean, it's the way that my understanding of the phenomenon has shaped and been informed by and changed my perspective on human history and the development of civilization and the origins of religion and everything in our meaning structures. Liminal Frames couldn't be, it's just the perfect title. But one of the things we talked about before we went on the show was, for people who are not familiar, there's this group, this infamous group that are within U.S. government known as the Collins Elite. And they are a group who are convinced that the evidence suggests that a large segment of the UFO phenomenon anyway is of a negative sort, and it's spiritual in nature, and its desires to deceive humanity. And to even pay attention to it, to acknowledge its existence, is to give it a foot in the door that can only go into bad places, can only result in bad outcomes for humanity. And so they've used that understanding to justify keeping this under wraps. And part of what I have no doubt is slowing the process of disclosure, even now as we await this report, is there are elements that are convinced to the core of their being that it is not a good idea to acknowledge this whatsoever. They will, perhaps even to the death, some of them, do their darndest to prevent that from happening, because they are convinced that it's the only way that can go is the demise of our civilization and even eternal damnation for human beings. Now, of course, as I said to you before we went on the show, I think what's strange about their situation is that I think they've got some of the initial data right, but I think it's their interpretation that really pushes that in one direction that could go in numerous directions and is more complicated than they're willing to accept. Although, again, part of the challenge is when you have a worldview, you often are blind to the limitations of your worldview. So I'm not suggesting they are being negative or domineering in their actions. I understand some people are thinking, what right do they have to make this decision for all of us? Mm-hmm. And that's a fair point. That's not usually how democracies work. But on the other hand, these people, in their defense, really do believe this. Mm-hmm. Now, you can be sincere and be sincerely wrong.
That's right.
And I think they are in this case. But on the other hand, while I don't think their answer is the correct one, I also recognize that you can't just broadcast these foundation level revelations to the masses overnight and not expect turmoil, not expect massive disruption. And so that's why I think you partly have seen evidence, and people like Grant Cameron have talked about this, managed disclosure, that over decades they've been slowly leaking this, acclimatizing the public to it so that when they do eventually talk about it, it's less of a shock, and there's less shock and awe because of that. But all that is to say, while everything I said is true about we do tend to, in our current situation, think about how can we militarize this, how can we use this to dominate our enemies, setting quotes. On the other hand, there are some people who are very early in their evolution, let's say it that way. It's not about people being evil. It's also not about these others being evil. It's about level of progression in consciousness. There are some people in the world, some human beings, that still think with kind of a warlord kind of mentality. If your gang doesn't take over this neighborhood, mine will, right? And that happens on a nation state scale sometimes. We think about Vladimir Putin. So knowing people like that are still in the world, and knowing some of them have immense power, and that's on us, that we've given people like that power. But because of that, there's a real gravity to this conversation. It is not simple answers. I know some people are convinced that, come on, disclosure yesterday, please. And I definitely want us to move towards disclosure, but I also recognize, to your earlier point, that we have to really think about this entire matter within the larger framework of consciousness development as individuals and as a collective civilization, because that's the only way we can move forward in a positive way, ultimately, when it comes to the revelations that are coming with this phenomenon.
Right, and we've talked about before that there really we can't take shortcuts. And in some respects, even though I agree with you that some of the reasons why things have been kept secret may not be the right reasons. On the other hand, I think about really where we are as a society and the conclusions we may come to, even with some of the more simplistic revelations that may come. Will that aid our development, or will it hinder it? In other words, are we on a path already as a civilization that is so perverted, so distorted from an ability to mature, that this kind of knowledge, it won't catalyze the change that we need to see. It will only further entrench us in some very powerful and negative ways in the habits that we've developed and nurtured for so long. We've talked about this as well. We're at this sort of juncture in our modern world where we're looking for meaning, and we feel an absence of meaning, let's put it that way. In so many of our institutions, we've lost faith in their purpose. The lack of trust in our leadership seems to be a pretty common theme, no matter what party you are a part of. And that points in the direction that we've lost these kind of deeper modes of understanding and of being in the world that nurture us on an individual and societal level. We've had tremendous advances in our understanding of the material world, but at what cost? And to continue to pursue technology for technology's sake, or knowledge for knowledge's sake, all the while ignoring the trauma that we are inflicting on ourselves and our successive generations by ignoring who we are on a fundamental level. We can't help but do real damage there. And I think about a lot of the encounters that we hear about from the experiencer community and from various different entity encounters, and it's a mixed bag there as well. Some of those encounters seem to be very instructional, seem to be very cautionary. You should focus on this and avoid doing that. Others are, to be blunt, very exploitative. They are the kinds of behavior that you hear about from some of the experiences match to things that we would do if we had the capability that these beings have. And I think when you step back and you look at it in the totality there, it's obvious that the sort of multiple, the grand diversity of beings that exist in the universe and the cosmos, that there are some that are just like us, but just have abilities that we don't have, And there are some that have far transcended where we are. Even our most enlightened humans that we might all point to and say, look at this person as the pinnacle of virtue, of human virtue. They far exceed that individual. And so I get the very real sense that there's a lot at stake, and that we are in a kind of training ground, if you will. And we're, in many cases, just completely missing the message that we receive, whether it's coming from a phenomenal source or not.
Yeah, as we continue this conversation, I'm just being made ever more aware of how nuanced it is, or how much nuance is necessary. Because I think no matter what direction we go here, we're going to offend some group or another,
Yep.
There are some well-meaning people. So we have on the one hand, like the Collins elite types, who have a background in fundamentalist Christianity, or they were led in that direction by colleagues and what they were seeing, to interpret it in a certain way, and largely a negative way, that these are nefarious, interdimensional beings, better known as demons in Christian theology, and nothing good comes from dealing with them, right? On the other hand, you have some groups in ufology, following kind of a Stephen Greer kind of mentality, who believe there can be no such thing as a negative alien or a less than benevolent alien. That they believe that we are the anomaly in terms of being a destructive race, but all these ET races are coming with messages of love and brotherhood and universal, solidarity.
They can do no wrong.
Exactly. And both of those takes are lacking in nuance, I would suggest. And just as we would not pick a certain group of people, I don't know, Thai people or Canadians or Australians, or whatever, we wouldn't say, there's nothing bad to say about Australians. They're all good. Every single one I ever met. I mean, I don't believe you if you tell me you met an Australian who was rude. I just don't think it's possible.
They are pretty great.
It's that kind of thing. Like we laugh at that because we realize Australians are a mix of people just like we are, as Americans and as human beings. And what I'm saying is you also find that in different ET species. And the process of consciousness development, again, happens across the board for all of these different groups, whether you think about them in terms of extraterrestrial or interdimensional or some combination of the two. And therefore, the expectation I think you should go with, which I think is later supported by evidence, by the way, in some of the data you just talked about, some people having very benevolent encounters, some people having encounters that seem very exploitative, like you said. Like the writing's on the wall there. Rather than trying to exclude one part of the data because it doesn't fit with your preferred notion, rather look at the data and say, what is this really suggesting? And I think it's suggesting there's groups of different levels of development. Some are more, again, it's not about good versus evil. It's about less developed versus more developed. And that really explains what's going on here. But again, as you can imagine, that really makes complicated this matter, because for those who believe that, come on, let's have disclosure yesterday, because once these ones are interacting with us, they'll give us free energy, they'll resolve climate change, they'll reverse all these negative things that we've produced, over the last century. But that assumes, of course, that all you'll open up the door to is the positive ones. And again, there's real question about that. So based on what we're seeing already with experiencer accounts. So that's at least a cautionary tale that I think both of those groups, and there's other groups, of course, too, but just even painting those two initial ones, I think it's a cautionary tale that either of those sort of black and white kind of worldviews don't play well with the data and don't promise very positive outcomes for us either way. I think we need something more nuanced. And the geopolitical stage beyond the Earth is in some ways just as complex as the one within the borders of the Earth. So that's something I think people should take into consideration.
I'm sensitive to a lot of our listeners who might be really frustrated by this because, and I can think about my own self on the journey that I've been here. been on here for these few years, none of these sound like easy answers. And I understand and I empathize with folks that don't want to hear that. That they would rather it just be, give us the craft, give us the technology, let's be welcomed into the cosmic neighborhood, and all will be well. Because in their minds, the truth is obscured from us, and that is the truth. And the truth, quite frankly, is, as it always often is, far more complex than that. And the introduction of the free energy or revolutionary transportation or reverse aging or whatever, insert your technology miracle of choice. If you think about those things, as amazing as they would be, in and of themselves, they don't solve any of our core problems. If anything, they just create more problems, at least for us where we are right now. And here's where I will echo what you said earlier. We might get a little bit uncomfortable with some of our audience, because I recognize that a lot of what we're talking about in our conversation is quite frankly deeply spiritual, and our culture has done a very good job for a long time now, really coming down hard on spirituality. And look, I totally understand. I've been a part of that. As many of you know, grew up in a spiritual home and had a spiritual practice for half of my life. And then I rejected it wholesale for many, many years, and would be quick to jump on those who would share a spiritual experience or view the world through a traditional spiritual perspective, and just write it all off as fantastical thinking or being delusionary. And I look back on that kind of person and think, wow, what a jerk. What kind of person does that and treats another human being and their experience and their worldview in that way. And now that I have begun to take it seriously again, ironically through the lens of the phenomena, which, as many people I think who start on this journey, it starts out as this nuts and bolts scientism, there's this neat thing happening that we just need to understand, and it's going to add to our knowledge. Where I have landed is in a strange place, a place that is familiar to me in some respects, but also very alien in many others. And so, I struggle with how to do the work of translating these insights to an audience that is not really ready or wanting to hear it. And I want to recognize I put myself in that audience. I'm in that audience. I have a difficult time with it. On the one hand, it is familiar to me, and it's exciting, and it kind of taps into this part of myself that I've ignored for a very long time. On the other hand, I know how it sounds. I'm just as a part of the culture as many of our listeners are, and I think through all of the kinds of counter arguments that they're thinking through when we begin to talk about things in this way. And so, Darren, where can we begin in, sort of righting this imbalance that we have in our world, and I think giving spirituality a healthy place and a better understanding of the grand scheme of reality?
Yeah, that's a really key question, and I think it would be good for us to unpack that a bit and go back and forth a bit on this, because I think a lot of times people have notions of what we mean when we say spirituality, or we bring up religion or something, and there are still some people who don't understand how that has anything to do with aliens and UFOs, and we have to break it down. But I think one way I would sort of summarize what you're pointing towards there is that the solution is not technology. The solution is not the introduction of powerful allies. The solution is always in consciousness. And in the same way that when we learned how to split the atom, we turned it into a bomb that could kill millions, because that's what our consciousness dictated at that time. If we get given even more powerful technologies without the requisite consciousness stage to do good things with it, the same thing will happen. And my understanding from the intelligences I've been in contact with, which are the benevolent ones, they are not interested in having a nanny state where they basically have to become an occupying force to hold our hands while we deal with these incredibly powerful technologies and make sure that we don't destroy ourselves while doing good things with them. That's not what they're in the business of doing. Because the entire enterprise, I would suggest to you, and we talked about this before we went on the air tonight, is that the point of the entire, the point of being here in this incarnation, both as individuals and as a collective civilization, is to wake up and to grow up. And waking up to recognizing we are more than the bodies that are around for a few decades and then decompose, and that we are more connected to each other than seems sometimes the case based on the way our culture treats people. So what we need to focus on is a step-by-step development in consciousness. That means it'll be different for different people and different even for different cultural groups around the world. We've talked before about how there are numerous different stages of consciousness online in the world right now. Even within our own country, there's 3 major different sort of developmental stages online at the same time, which means, I will again remind people, it means that they see the world effectively different. And some people and again, I've pointed this out before too, it's called the pre-trans fallacy. Someone who's at a less evolved consciousness stage will look at some of what we're talking about and think it sounds ridiculous and like magical thinking again, because for them it's beyond the ceiling of their consciousness, so they go to the next level down on the consciousness spiral, and to them it sounds a lot like magical thinking, right? That we're just leaning on, the sun gods or something to save us, right? That kind of thinking again. So, like you said, no easy answers, and it has to be step by step, but we do have to start. We have to start somewhere. And we have to recognize, I think, with the UFO phenomenon, that means that also is a complex situation involving multiple consciousness stages. And we need to do a good job of discerning. We need to do a better job of discerning the motivations of these different groups. As I pointed out to you, my understanding is that some of the most benevolent groups, some of the most evolved groups, are also the ones that are the most concerned about not biasing our future by helping us to because they want us to learn the lessons that really matter. They don't want to just come in and solve problems, because this iteration is not the ultimate end game. It's what happens to our souls, if you will, what happens to the part of us that never dies but just reiterates, and what happens to the planetary consciousness that we are a part of, because again, in a non-dual sense, we are all connected to each other. How can we grow up as a collective and as individuals? That's what the most benevolent ones are interested in. Some of the less benevolent ones are more interested in trying to further less than universal aims, because they themselves are not yet at that level of consciousness. And so we need to be very wary of groups that are promising certain kinds of things, but at what cost and at what price, and what are we exchanging to get that kind of deal? And we've talked before about even administrations who have perhaps made accords with various groups of others that allowed for things like abductions of citizens in exchange for technology. That's the kind of accord that's been made in the past. So again, this points to fundamentally a problem in consciousness more than about technology or anything else.
Are there any signs of encouragement that we can look at and say, hey, this is a good development? Because quite frankly, I'm looking at the government and their handling of this topic, and I understand that they may have done certain things for good reason, but I look at where we are with that conversation and where we are as a society. I'm struggling to find some real glimmers of hope here that there are individuals or leaders having the conversation that needs to be had about what is really happening. And the fact that we're really just kind of beginning to throw, at least in a public way, we're throwing our science at it, through this NASA study and through some of the individuals that are involved with the UAP task force, you don't really see a lot of individuals, at least not in the public realm, who come from other disciplines, who might be inclined to look at this and promote an understanding that is that goes beyond, scientific exploitation of technology. Are there any glimmers of hope that you see? And if not, to me, then the conclusion I would come to is it's kind of up to us at the individual level, or a more local level, to be the change that needs to take place, and to take charge of our own development, and not lean on somebody else to kind of solve our problems for us. And quite frankly, that's a big part of many spiritual teachings throughout history. It's the journey that we all have to take in our lifetime of maturing and gaining wisdom and how we treat one another. These are not things that the state can solve. So how do you think about this, and do you see any areas of optimism here?
Yeah, that's also a huge question, which we could spend
good luck with that
7 months unpacking.
Yeah.
And we talked about some of the implications before we went on the air. There's a few different directions I want to go with that. One, in terms of what glimmers of hope are there. Well, I would say this. I would say that in the same way I've been impacted with a positive interaction with some of these intelligences, and it's helped reframe my understanding. It's helped me wake up to a larger reality that extends beyond this iteration and this material existence that looks material and physical and solid, but is actually, again, more of a dreamscape kind of thing. There are many people that are being woken up in similar ways, and I'm contacted pretty regularly because of my podcast by people who are on the same kind of trajectory and have felt almost like activated, that when they heard my voice, they said, I feel like I'm supposed to get a hold of this person and maybe somehow be involved in something they're involved in the future. And so there actually are, movements underway. I've told you about some of them, to hopefully manifest some of this in some practical ways, not just be all wishful thinking, but begin to actually model ways that human beings together could live differently and prioritize differently. I think also we talked before we went on the air about something called spiritual bypass. That's something we have to be aware of too, is that you brought up a very good point that, how do we keep that sort of bigger picture in mind, while not at the same time, undermining or downplaying or belittling the very real things we need to be concerned about, with our families and what's going on in the environment, things that are happening in this iteration. And I think the balance, as I often try to say, is to toggle between the two. I think having both a relative and an absolute view and being able to toggle between the two and see how they relate really matters. In the same way that Donald Hoffman says he doesn't jump in front of a train, not because he takes the train literally. There actually is no train, right? But because that signifies something that is real, that it's significant even though it's not literally there, and there will be real implications. In the same way, the things we do, even if this is a dreamscape, the things we do here have real implications on what we take with us, both as a collective culture, a kind of collective mind, and as individuals. So it all plays together. I think the freedom is that it allows us to not be completely caught up in what happens in this iteration, because there will always be another one. And what matters most of all is the lessons we learn in this one. But ideally, we want to work on both levels, that we want to make decisions that will help the here and now and the people around us, the animals around us, the environment around us, but also that are based on principles that will help evolve our souls and that we take that with us into the next iteration. But again, to your point that you sort of brought up at the end of what you said there, I think it's very important that we need to really watch for when we're trying to have some sort of mommy or daddy figure come in and fix the problem for us. Because the truth, I think, of this multidimensional cosmos we live in that's richly populated with all these different intelligences is that we are given the opportunity to thrive or die, and it's on us. And largely the ones above us, beyond us, are trying to be hands-off so that we learn the lessons for the right reasons. We don't do it because some God told us you can't do that, or because some overarching benevolent ET says you can't do that, but because we understand in our core why it's not helpful ultimately to do that as individuals and as a collective society.
It reminds me that even mundane experience can have ultimate significance, in that there are so many moments of opportunity to learn from what is happening in any iteration or any experience. And as you pointed out, even if we can continue to improve or have another chance, have another crack at, getting our development right or getting back on the right track or path, it still ultimately means that the entire journey is significant and important. You can't skip a class here. So that means that every experience that we have, every moment, every encounter, every hardship, every joy, all of these things are a part of and a necessary part of this journey, of this becoming. And I think that's an important takeaway, that we can get really often very fixated on the future, certainly within circles of belief. There's often a fixation on the afterlife, or on the end, and how all the problems of the day, my problems that exist in my life, they'll be resolved and solved, and everything's great, and we're all singing hymns, and everything's fine. And I think that does an incredible disservice to the lessons and experiences that we have in our life, that contribute to who we are and who we become, and the wisdom that we will gain. And if we go through all of that and we don't come away from that a better person, we have completely failed, right? And that's just that's not a sort of fanciful statement. I can tell you that is true just by the interactions I have with people that I care about. If I have experiences with them where I let them down or I make the wrong choice, that has a real impact on me and on them and our relationship. Those are growth opportunities, and we can point to those points in our lives where we can say, yeah, I messed up and I learned something there, and I won't do that again, because doing that again is a step back, not a step forward. And essentially that's kind of what we're getting at here. And I know I'm sounding very preachy, but I think it's hard not to come to those conclusions given the kinds of things that we're talking about, anything that has ultimate significance.
Yeah, I think that's right on. I think that, to get back to your earlier question, what we can take away from this is that regardless of what's happening on the geopolitical stage, and regardless of what the U.S. government's doing in terms of admitting what it knows, we can always make changes now that are positive. We are always in the position, even when we feel like we're in a tight space and we don't have much wiggle room, there's always that little bit of wiggle room. And maybe by making positive choices there, you create a bit more. People, based on their situation, which nation state they're born into, their economic class, how loving their parents were, all those things matter, right, in terms of how much freedom people have. We're not saying it's all equal.
Right.
But we are saying that wherever you are, do what you can to move forward. And that what you do in moving forward doesn't just mean for you, it means for everybody. Because again, what we're saying here, and this is really essential, and it's really hard to get across to people who are not familiar with this idea, but it's central to this entire question about spirituality, about ultimate meaning, about the UFO phenomenon, about everything, is that a revelation of non-duality is key. That to harm another is to harm myself. And I don't just mean in some sort of principle because some God, again, told me that, because that's just fundamentally true. That's as much or even more true than gravity. And this is a law of the cosmos. Not a law because someone said it has to be this way, but just because that is the nature of it. That In the same way we recognize that it doesn't make any sense for one nation to make decisions about how it's going to pollute, and everybody else makes their own decisions, because we live in one planet that shares an atmosphere, and what one country does affects every other country. And we are now in the process of wrestling awkwardly between having weapons of mass destruction pointed at each other while at the same time trying to make accords about pollution, right? This is kind of the bizarreness of the situation. But again, whenever we make decisions that can help all of us move forward, we either can, or we either do or we don't. And when we don't, there's real ramifications too. And I don't just mean here, because you maybe will get ahead, right? Maybe you can cheat and steal and get ahead for a little while, but there's no way in the long term, in moving from the relative to the absolute scale, that that's going to pay off for you. But you need to learn that from the level of the first principles, not from the point of view that you may go to jail if you get caught, right? Or you may get punished and put in hell if a God finds out you did it, right? It's not about that. It's about really, we are given the powers of gods to make all the right or wrong decisions and to experience the consequences of those decisions. And that those consequences are meant to be realized over many lifetimes. And that's why what happens here, while it does matter, it's not the ultimate meaning, it's not the ultimate context. And so that's what we're facing here. It is complex, it is nuanced. And on the one hand, it's about trying to make decisions about moving forward with the right groups of these others and moving together in one accord as one planetary civilization. Big questions around that, but it also comes down to, what can I do for my neighbor today? What can I do in small ways to make the world better? Because ultimately I know I'm benefiting everyone, including myself, when I think with that mentality. Right,
we are deeply entangled, not just with each other, but with these others and the cosmos itself, and that's an inescapable truth. I'm reminded of a couple of things. The Ariel School incident, where the children were told, we're becoming too technologied. It certainly rings true in this conversation. And we've so often taken that in the direction of our nuclear weapons or other things. But it's ironic to me that we live in a day and age where our technology allows us to be connected in ways that we've never been connected before. And yet we seem really far apart from one another. And so, that is almost a case in point to say that technology on its own accord is not going to save us. It doesn't solve these fundamental issues about how we treat one another and how we relate to one another. We can go onto Twitter and we can connect all day long, or we can go onto Facebook and reach out to that old high school classmate from many years ago and share stories, or catch up on their families and feel like we're really connecting. But the truth of the matter is, it takes a lot more work than that, and it takes a lot more work than just signing in and lobbing a virtual stone at somebody who we just happen to disagree with in that moment. And that's what's also frustrating to me, is we can look out at the landscape of our culture right now, no matter what party you find yourself in, on the political divide. And I think you can agree that we're not listening to each other. We're not giving each other space to be who we are. We are not being charitable. And a lot of what it will require is charity and grace and being open to change, and not being quick to judge and to get easy points and wins over somebody else. And it's if we can look at our world today and come away with that kind of insight, imagine what other beings who might be at different developmental stages than us, imagine how they think about where we are. And I wonder too, do they reflect on their own journeys and go, yeah, I remember kind of what it was like when I was trapped in that way of thinking.
Yeah, I think of several directions to go in reflecting on what you just said. One is that, again, having a nuanced perspective, we're not saying that laws don't matter, or that we should never legislate something to be good and something to be bad.
Right.
You know, we do have to make decisions for the benefit of the whole, or at least the benefit of the majority. But what we are saying is that you can't just legislate morality outside of a context of relationship and conversation. That if we disagree with people politically or around moral laws or whatever, then let's be in conversation about it. Let's be in dialogue. To legislate morality while simultaneously suppressing people who think differently will not make the problem go away.
Right.
And to the same principle that I was pointing to before, that these more sophisticated others that are benevolent, what they're interested in is that the kids grow up. The kids graduate having learned the lessons themselves so they can become responsible adults and lead families and civilizations. And so in the same way, you know, when we talk about moving forward as a civilization, it has to be in dialogue. We have to get beyond my team versus your team and get beyond the notion that ideas alone are how you build strong societies. Strong societies have to be in dialogue. You have to allow some room for difference of opinion, because if you don't, it just gets suppressed and becomes shadow, and then it just flares up and becomes more of a problem later on. And most fundamentally, you never dealt with the actual problem then. It's like burying sewage or something, or you know, taking nuclear waste and putting it in a third world country so they can deal with it. That doesn't do anybody good in the long run. That's the kind of mentality we need to bring to this.
Yeah, and it seems as if too that the problem could in fact and you hinted this just now, it could get worse. That if we can't resolve some of the behavior that we have that are just as a child inevitably does grow into an adult, if they don't come to an awareness of how to behave, you know, with others and gain that kind of maturity, they're still going to inhabit an adult body and can do a much greater degree of damage than they could as a child. And I think we're seeing some of that. I don't know what you would say about this, but it seems to me that we see some of that on display with some of the encounters that we hear about. That there are entities that have greater capability than we have to manipulate the world that we inhabit, but they're incredibly destructive at the same time. It's literally like a kid who's grown up into an adult and they're just wreaking havoc inside of the department store or something because they didn't understand how to behave.
Or I think of Lord of the Flies, right? That story is about these kids who are, you know, kind of left on an island to rule themselves, and it doesn't go so well.
Right.
Yeah, it's that kind of notion, right? And so we're really sort of pointing people towards the idea of context here. Make context in terms of it being about more than just me and my tribe, but also being about more than just this iteration, right? And this planet. And that we're also saying there's an incredible responsibility here. Because again, I think what I'm trying to say to people is rather than there being a spiritual realm and then a physical realm, however you want to, you know, describe that, and that you have this, like you kind of pointed out before, this notion of these, you know, benevolent angels that serve a god who sits on a cloud and people playing harps and hanging out and having a good time, singing hymns. And then you have the rest of creation, which is a bunch of sentient entities that are finite beings that will ultimately be punished or rewarded by this God figure. Rather than having that very dualistic notion of reality, what I'm saying is that the meaning of spirituality is invested in the entire cosmos, that there is no separation between the two. One of the things I was saying to you before we went on the air is that almost everything we see a physical manifestation of is actually a derivative of an underlying spiritual reality. So I think this is why even things like sometimes astrology gets some things right. That's why the idea of ley lines in a planet, you know, or chakras in a human being, these really are physical aspects of underlying realities that are, whether it's physical in a human body or on a cosmological scale. They have spiritual meanings behind, or energetic meanings behind the physical manifestation. So it's a lot of responsibility, but it's also a lot of opportunity. That's what I'm saying. That's what life is. It's about not about some overarching God that wants to punish or set a bunch of rules because they're just arbitrarily decided and he likes to be in power. But rather that we, each of us, are given all the freedom in the world to destroy ourselves or to liberate ourselves. That's what we're really coming down to here. And that's a weighty, there's a lot of gravity to that. And some people are not prepared for that. Some people, I would even argue, as I said to you before we went on the air tonight, that some of the origins of our religions were about some of these other groups that were more advanced than us and benevolent, coming and trying to inspire us. And we, kind of like the whole cargo cult notion, assumed they were gods, right? Not, again, we're back to duality again. They're not like us anyways. They're God beings. So we have to serve them. What do we need to do to sacrifice whatever it takes, animals, children, whatever, to appease them, rather than realizing that we actually are just like them, just not quite as evolved yet. So this is the challenge, because a lot of people, just like in history, took these messages of brotherhood, right, of siblinghood, and have turned it into an us versus them in terms of the God beings and the lesser mortals. And in the same way that those were perverted eventually by people who wanted power, whether it's the ancient Egyptians and what happened with the pyramids, as I was saying to you before we went on the air, or the message of Jesus of Nazareth, which was very non-dual in nature, and yet it's been remarkably distorted over time. To now we have some very regressive aspects of American culture that have defined a notion of religion tied to that figure historically, but at the same time arguing for, all sorts of other crazy ideas. I'm not going to name them, but it's basically, your wish list of regressive thinking, and you just throw Jesus on top to make it sound like it's somehow justified.
Right.
This is the challenge we face. Again, it comes down to the problem fundamentally, and the opportunity fundamentally, and the solution fundamentally is always about consciousness.
Well, I'm cognizant of where we are in this moment, and we've had a great conversation this evening, and the fire has been really nice to watch. And just the atmosphere has been really pleasant, but not just this moment that we have and are sharing together, but also this time we are in, and where we are all waiting for hopefully the next revelation from the powers that be. What would you advise is the right stance, the well-placed intention as we not only wait for this next announcement, but wait for whatever it is, insert, for our listeners, insert desire of choice that disclosure solves for you. What would be your advice on how to reframe our mindset and expectations?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is be wary of, and this is about developing self-awareness, which I've often lobbied for on this show. Be wary of the spectacle of the UFO phenomenon. Be wary of putting your own development to the side and being caught up in the spectacle of the notion of intelligent others being here with sophisticated craft. Don't get caught up so much in that you forget the most important aspect of why you're here. And let that inform your decisions about why you're here, but don't let it take you off track. Because regardless of whether disclosure happens tomorrow or next year or for a decade from now or never, your place here, your role here, your task here is the same. And And also I would add to that, the messages from the benevolent groups, we already know. We don't have to wait for them to say it on the White House lawn. Right? I mean, when you look back at the history, both in terms of the initial origins of some of our religious traditions, which again were later kind of became more about laws and do's and don'ts, but were initially about this kind of invitation to meaning and cooperation. In the same way that, and add to that the notion of people like me and other people who've had positive encounters with these beings and have heard very positive, encouraging messages that say that you are eternal, you can't die, but the decisions you make have real impact not only in this life but in future iterations. Things you do now in this lifetime will very much set up what will or won't happen, or what opportunities are presented to you or not in the next lifetime. Again, not because of some punitive God figure or some overarching alien intelligence, but because consequences are real. And you are given total freedom. We are all given total freedom in this cosmos to make decisions that either benefit us or not, and to learn the lessons thereof. That's what it really comes down to. That's what I would encourage people to focus on, is what can I do to keep moving forward? How can I be a part of the best parts of the UFO phenomenon, but at the same time being conscious of and discerning of some of the elements that might not be in our best interest. And like we talked about tonight, don't fall for the notion that if we just get the right technological tools, that will solve the problems, because it will not. In some ways, it could exacerbate the problems. It could perpetuate the same situation, especially if these technologies help us to wield more power over the physical world, setting quotes. We may be caught up more and more in the delusion, more and more caught up in the whirlpool, rather than recognizing the whirlpool is ultimately just the water, it's just the ocean. So, be careful what you ask for. This is a cautionary tale. At the same time, I'm saying everything you need is already there for you. And that there are others that are willing to help us as we move forward, whether people think about these in terms of their angels or their spirit guides or whatever, however you wanted to describe them, benevolent aliens, it doesn't really matter what label you use. Just like, we now like to help and lift up the animal species and take care of them, in the same way some of these others definitely want to help us move forward too. But it has to be by us learning the principled lessons, not by just solving the problem today, Give someone a fish or teach them to fish, right? It's that kind of difference.
Right.
That's what they're interested in, is this second. And we can move forward, make positive decisions, and also expect help from them in that process.
And I'm reminded too of something that we talked about before we went on the air, and that's the importance of relational learning and meaning, to be in dialogue with others, to invest part of yourself in another person, and to be vulnerable with another person, and reciprocate in kind in those relationships, because really relationality is also fundamentally part of reality itself. That there's a reason why we are individuated consciousnesses having an experience. It's not just for our own sake, that there are more things we can learn through our collective experience with one another, our engagement with reality and experience, that adds to the whole. So it's cumulative. It has a compounding benefit. And to look for opportunities to get into dialogue with others, to help others, to put others before yourself. These are time-honored things that I'm not making it up. These are things that are part of some of our grandest traditions. And I think if you find yourself in doing those things, the value is self-evident. And it's not, as we've talked about tonight, it's not just that we might be having a conversation with a fellow human. We might be having a conversation with a fellow human who may also be, someone who's in a human instantiation, that they have had other experiences throughout their lifetimes, in other modalities, and there are opportunities there. There's wisdom to mine there from that interaction. And so, it's incredibly valuable to do so. I found it to be incredibly valuable to be in dialogue with you and with those others in our community who have a good faith interest in having the conversation. So I would say to those that are waiting on this report to relax a little bit, not worry too much about it. As you said, the answers are already here in many, many ways. To instead not fixate on the spectacle, but engage where you are, and look for ways that living and being can get deeper than it is. There are tremendous benefits to that way of being in the world, and if we get sidetracked by the shiny things in the sky, then I think we can often miss the point.
Yeah, that, and getting caught up in the shiny things that we like to collect, so we think we're winning the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was thinking about when you mentioned earlier, calling an old high school friend, and often what that comes down to is talking about really silly, inconsequential things, like, what kind of house you're living in now, what are you driving, where do you live, And rather than talking about, how many of those conversations are of the nature where we say, so what kind of, what kind of energetic things are you working through? What kind of, impurities have you burned through this year as you seek to grow your soul, right? We don't usually have those kind of conversations, whether it's at the supermarket or on the phone with someone we went to high school with or whatever, or sometimes even the people we spend the most time with.
Right.
But that's the conversations we should be having. And again, I think when you think about it from this perspective, you realize it's in your best interest and it's in everybody else's best interest. And ultimately, that is the same interest.
Yes. Yeah, well said. Well, I enjoyed this second experience in the outdoors. I'm hopeful that it was a little quieter than the last. I apologize for any errant noises that bother some of our listeners. I'm sure we'll hear about it nonetheless. Thank you for investing your time in our show. We don't take that for granted. We very much enjoy your feedback, and we haven't done a listener question show really in quite some time. It might be something worth tackling in the future as our audience continues to engage with us in this important topic. So as we close, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.